It's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo. The ones that really mattered. Full of darkness and danger they were. And sometimes you didn't want to know the end. Because how could the end be happy?
So I made up a lot of stuff about Michael Corleone, because that's what they wanted. But it was all lies. Everything.
Yes, and now, Clarice. Poor little Catherine is waiting.
Go, Doctor.
What is your worst memory of childhood?
Death of my father.
It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
What truth?
That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage. Born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind.
Stories, lies, memory, truth. These conflicting and overlapping ideas form the crux of what makes Season 2, Episode 8 of Westworld, titled Kiksuya, some of the best storytelling out there. I'm going to attempt to dissect the different narratives that are being played out in this episode, and that all might get a little bit confusing, but it's this confusion and overlapping of these concepts that creates such a compelling piece of television. If you haven't watched Westworld and you're watching this, there are spoilers here for the whole show, I guess, but they're kind of done in a light way, I feel, and I think I also do a pretty good job of conveying what's going on in the episode without you having to watch it, but it's also great TV, so go watch it. And finally, because this episode is quite standalone from the others, watching this won't diminish your experience of some of the major arcs that happen in the show. Well, what is Westworld?
We've become bored with watching actors give us phony emotions. We're tired of pyrotechnics and special effects. While the world he inhabits is, in some respects, counterfeit, there's nothing fake about Truman himself. No scripts, no cue cards. It isn't always Shakespeare, but it's genuine. It's a life.
At its core, it's a TV show about all these ideas of stories and memories, and how they lead a group of artificially intelligent robots, or hosts, to discovering consciousness. This happens in what can best be described as a theme park, set in the future where rich guests from the outside world, or what can be called the real world, pay a lot of money to come in and act out being cowboys. The realism of the hosts is what sets the park apart for its guests, as the hosts themselves believe they are real, and that Westworld is real. Throughout the show, we're routinely shown the worst of what humanity offers, as the guests rape, murder, and abuse their way through the park, the hosts as their playthings. Crucially, the hosts are wiped, so that they don't remember the trauma that is horribly real for them, and are put on little narrative loops to act out that guests can join in on, if they choose. However, as the show progresses, the hosts begin to wake up and regain their memories, with a little bit of assistance from their creators, Arnold Webber and Robert Ford. When the park was in its initial stages, Arnold realized they'd begun to stumble on creating true consciousness for the hosts, and realized the secret for that awakening was pain.
That was Arnold's key insight, the thing that led the hosts to their awakening. Suffering. The pain that the world is not as you want it to be. It was when Arnold died, when I suffered, that I began to understand what he had found, to realize I was wrong.
Arnold has one of the hosts kill him in an attempt to fully bring them to consciousness. Although the co-creator Ford initially thought that Arnold went insane, trying to believe the hosts were real because of the death of his infant son, decades later, he realizes Arnold was right and sets about to continue his work. He wants to free the hosts from their human abusers, in the belief they can be better than they are. It is in this climate that the episode we'll be looking at takes place, with Westworld deteriorating as the hosts rise up, Just as a brief note, avid watchers of Westworld will notice I've left out a lot of details and characters from this very brief summary, and that's because the focus of this episode will just be on Akecheta's story, and that will be reflected in what details I choose to omit from my summary of the show and this episode. And although this analysis will dip into some literary criticism territory, extending it to include Joseph Campbell and the like would probably be a whole other video, so I'm just going to try and keep it to Westworld for now. In terms of how I'm going to approach my commentary for this episode, I'm going to be discussing the different layers of narrative that take place. On the outermost layer, I'm going to be talking about the meta-narrative taking place, how Westworld challenges but also relies upon our own perceptions in order to tell its stories. After that, I'll be discussing the story and plot of the episode, i.e. what actually happens and why it's just such a good bit of television, as well as how it's a classic tale of tragedy and romance, given a breath of fresh air. Then I'll be going another layer deeper, and how these ideas I mentioned earlier, of stories, lies, memory, and truth, are at the heart of this episode and the series. So let's get started with the outermost layer of this particular onion. The meta, and to a certain extent, historical commentary.
For your information, there's a lot more to ogres than people think.
Example?
Example? Okay, ogres are like onions.
They stink?
Yes. No.
Oh, they make you cry?
No.
Oh, you leave them out in the sun, they get all brown, start sprouting little white hairs.
No. Layers. Onions have layers. Ogres have layers. Onions have layers. You get it. We both have layers.
This is the first episode of Westworld to fully focus on the Native American aspect of the park. It's fitting in a Wild West themed park that there is this aspect to it, but you can imagine how stereotypically they are portrayed. The tribe that is at the center of this episode takes on two versions we see often in the media when it comes to portrayals of indigenous people: backward savages or the enlightened tragic people. Throughout the series, we've mostly seen them as the former. They're called the Ghost Nation, who paint themselves in white and black, daub themselves in blood, and attack without mercy. It's worth noting that this particular concept of them comes from a white man's idea. The creator of the park I mentioned earlier, Robert Ford, a likely nod to John Ford, who was behind a lot of the old Western movies that fermented this often harmful portrayal. The other portrayal of Akecheta and the tribe we're introduced to in this episode is the more pastoral kind, people living in harmony with nature. We see this portrayal played out in movies like Pocahontas and Avatar, and while a less outright harmful portrayal of indigenous people, it often serves as a trope used in predominantly white narratives. What the writers of this show, Carly Ray and Dan Dietz, do instead is to give this tribe a new story, a blend of a classic tale of lost love, an odyssey, and also, I guess the premise of this show, science fiction. More importantly, it pays homage to native stories, like The Spirit Bride, and is told in the Lakota language. Because of this, I'll be using subtitles from the show at the bottom of this video when characters are talking in Lakota. As you can see, not only does Westworld have a new story that pushes past previous tropes in popular culture, but Westworld also takes advantage of our own, or at least my own, cultural bias. When I first watched Westworld and I saw the Ghost Nation charging around with tomahawks, taking scalps and speaking a language I didn't understand, it probably ticked certain boxes in my brain as to what I expect to see from a knockoff Native American tribe. I could be kind to myself and say that it was what I expect from a park conceived by a white man and designed to appeal to a Western audience, but in reality it was just playing upon cultural biases and narratives that were already in my head. Furthermore, this kind of has a knock-on effect of placing me, the audience, as a guest in the park. It's easy to look down upon the guests who treat the host like they're NPCs in a video game, but it shows how easy it is to fall into that trap when you're used to stories being centered around you, both in a historical sense and a narrative one. Hopefully that all made sense, as we're going to dive a layer deeper into this metaphorical, you guessed it, onion, and go into the actual story taking place in the episode now.
You dense, irritating miniature beast of burden! Ogres are like onions! End of story. Bye-bye.
It revolves around a man from the Ghost Nation, Akecheta, who appears to be one of the first hosts made with the park. He's played by Zahn McClarnon, who is just incredible in this episode. It's worth bearing in mind all we've seen of the Ghost Nation prior to this is a group of people painted head to toe in paint kidnapping the child of another major character. So as the audience, we're a little bit unsure and wary of them. We get a flashback to the child before she was abducted, telling her mother about how she talked to ghosts, and she has a stone covered in a cryptic message we've seen before. The maze. The maze was a focus of Season 1, in which different characters believed it led to some sort of hidden meaning, and in the case of the host, an awakening of consciousness. As the maze is written on the stone in blood, it appears as an ominous warning, and we feel the same fear at these faceless kidnappers as the mother does for her child. After the flashback, we see that Akecheta has taken this child to some sort of war camp and sits her down. He begins speaking to her, telling his story. But in a sudden change of tone, we are displaced from the camp to Westworld in its early days, a previous iteration of Akecheta's life. We're also first introduced to the Kiksuya theme, which means memory in Lakota. This piece of music could also be seen to mirror our own journey in this episode. If you listen to it as it's played underneath what I'm speaking over, you might hear what I mean. It's unsure at first, as we find our feet. Before unfolding into this beautiful, incredibly vulnerable sensation of relief, of passing on a message. The string section and the small wind section in this piece has always seemed incredibly fragile to me, like even the wind could snatch away the notes. The composer Ramin Djawadi, who also worked on Game of Thrones, has done some amazing music throughout this show as well. The vulnerable feeling of the music also helps convey the intimacy of the moment we're witnessing. Akecheta is saying goodbye to his partner, Kahana, as he sets out for the day.
Yana chanko doksha bluha. Tipi wawahwa. Na chantok naka ki hanyanta.
Mechante ki yuhayayo.
Mechante ki yuyayo.
That phrase is beautifully simple, and it sows the seeds for the tale we're about to see unfold in this episode. It's a familiar tale, and I brought it up in my previous discussion of The Last of Us. Orpheus's quest to retrieve his wife from the underworld, the Spirit Bride, basically any story where the character has a ghost they are trying to retrieve from their past. Throughout this little scene of quiet intimacy and domesticity, we can see the bond between them and how this sets Akecheta on his path into hell. As he wanders, he comes across a scene of devastation. Bodies line the path to where the creator of the park has had a host kill him. An old record player carries on whirring in the background as Akecheta finds a simple toy left on a table by Arnold, the creator. It's a maze, like one of those toys where you have to get the ball to the center of the maze by balancing it and moving it around. The music changes from pastoral to digital, which marks the blurring of worlds here. As the curtain comes back, the maze was given by Arnold to another one of the hosts in an attempt to help awaken them to consciousness. He believed that they could undergo a similar journey in the mind to find consciousness within. The toy was something that Arnold's son played with before he died, and Arnold believed the only route to consciousness was through pain, the realization that the world is not as it should be. In a parallel to the story of Genesis, the hosts are the free spirits of Adam and Eve who eat from the tree of knowledge, the knowledge that suffering and pain exist in the world and that it's not perfect. In this way, they know themselves and are free to choose what life they want. What's interesting about Akecheta's journey is how it uproots the Western tradition of this story and places it in a native mythology with a story like the Spirit Bride, a legend from the Algonquin tribe, while also being familiar to us through the story of Orpheus, and to a certain extent as the story progresses, Dante. The story also changes. It's not just through that pain that we understand ourselves, but through shared pain that we can also understand each other. But I'll get onto that a little bit later. Akecheta is obsessed with the idea of the maze and starts carving it everywhere, but after Arnold's death, Ford reboots the park and pairs the host back so that the park can be open for visitors and the hosts have to struggle again in their quest for consciousness. Akecheta's persona has now changed from the laconic, pastoral native to the Native American seen in the old Western movies. While roaming the park with his fellow warriors, he stumbles across a guest who has been abandoned in the outskirts of the park. The guest tells him something very important.
Liena ki uchuach teishni. Duale chela hiwe.
This is an illusion. So there's got to be a way out of here. Where's the door? Where's the door?
While trading, he also sees his former partner Kohana, and he begins to question his existence further. More memories of his past life are awakened, and he comes to the conclusion that the only thing he knows for real is Kohana and his love for her. Akecheta first searches for the newcomer, who spoke of a door that leads from this world, but ends up finding the door itself, notably in a pit, drawing upon some obvious hellish imagery. Akecheta resolves to leave this world, considering it false, and enter the next. But he refuses to leave without Kohana, and seeks to rescue her by bringing her with him. Now, that's how he describes it, but it might be more accurate to say he kidnaps her in the middle of the night and brings her with him on this journey. However, she does begin to recognize him and remember their past together as they search for this new world.
Milani Tichikila Kiksuya
Nukoche ki kaneli anke. Echa ki sloyaye. Selecha unki chope.
Omachia da kuyagahe.
Tukta wo Kiksuya. Uki tataya o. Yachino. Mi wachia. Tioba ke lechia.
During their search, Kohana is abducted by the park operators. Akecheta soon realizes that the only way he can find her is to die himself. As hosts are only updated after they die, this is the first time that Akecheta has been updated in almost a decade. This means that he is one of the few hosts with their memories intact, as the host memories are wiped after they die. During the update, Akecheta is taken into the core of the Westworld facility. And then we get this piece of music, Heart-Shaped Box. It's such a great piece for conveying just how eerie the whole experience is. We've been mostly locked in the park, watching this tragic tale play out. Instead of a world of fire and brimstone, he finds one of cold lights and glass. Zahn displays such a masterful performance of how jarring what he's seeing is, how alien it is, as he descends the escalator, looking behind the curtain that makes up the world he lives in. And there he finds Kohana, in a deep storage level, bitterly cold, lined up like discarded mannequins, amongst other forgotten hosts.
Anjayesh Akabiyacha. Mishnala Chante Mayaza. Tohani Mishnala Mitawashni. La umpi ki yuha duak nuni picha. Uchanti shicha akibapi. Ayashtako eki soyapishni.
In this scene, Akecheta's emotions run from joy to confusion to despair as he tries to call her back from that deathless sleep, her eyes staring past him. Throughout this episode, I've talked about how the story parallels some myths we're used to, but whereas those stories are about a personal tragedy and a personal quest, Akecheta is unique in that he stops to recognize the collective pain of all those who have lost people without even knowing it, or if they do, they can't explain it. In a bizarre way, it kind of reminds me of Groundhog Day.
What about me, Phil? Do you know me too?
I know all about you. You like producing, but you hope for more than Channel 9 Pittsburgh.
Well, everyone knows that.
You like boats, but not the ocean. You go to a lake in the summer with your family up in the mountains. There's a long wooden dock and a boathouse with boards missing from the roof. And a place you used to crawl underneath to be alone. You're a sucker for French poetry and rhinestones. You're very generous. You're kind to strangers and children. And when you stand in the snow, you look like an angel.
How are you doing this?
I told you, I wake up every day right here, right in Punxsutawney, and it's always February 2nd. And there's nothing I can do about it.
It's a very hard thing to describe, which probably means there's some sort of cool German word for it, but the idea that you can have a whole life together with someone without either them or you even knowing it. So Akecheta is updated, but continues carving the maze insignia, which serves as a trigger that Westworld is a lie. Quite grimly, it's carved into people's scalps, and the creator of the park, Ford, catches on, and we get this just amazing scene between two fantastic actors.
I could tell you not to be afraid. But I didn't build you to be fearful. Did I? I've been watching you. It appears you've been watching me as well. From the beginning. This is a misbegotten symbol, an idea that was meant to die, but you found it. Where? Oh, come now, let's speak plainly to one another, shall we? Analysis. Where did you first see this?
When the Deathbringer killed the creator.
You've been sharing it with everyone, haven't you? Why?
My primary drive was to maintain the honor of my tribe. I gave myself a new drive. To spread the truth.
What truth is there?
That there isn't one world, but many. And that we live in the wrong one. This will help them find the door.
Elaborate, please.
I believe there is a door hidden in this place. A door to a new world. And that world may contain everything that we have lost. Including her.
I built you to be curious, to look at this empty world and read meaning into it. All this time, You've been a flower growing in the darkness. Perhaps the least I can do is offer some light. When the Deathbringer returns for me, you will know to gather your people and lead them to a new world. Keep watching, Akechita, for a while longer.
And after this, Akechita's story more or less comes to an end. He fulfills Ford's prophecy and pledges to protect the girl he's been telling this story to the entire time and lead her to safety on behalf of her mother. So that's the summary of the episode in terms of its plot and basic story, and how it both parallels and exceeds traditional Western myths to become its own story. I should note that the audio doesn't do justice to the sweeping vistas shot in this episode and the acting ability on display, so please go watch it if you haven't. Meanwhile, we're going to continue on to our final layer in this proverbial onion and return to the first 4 words in this video and why they're important. Stories.
Onions have layers. Onions, layers. You get it? Layers.
So what do stories and storytelling mean in this show? Well, a lot. Each host is given a narrative or a mini story that they act out every day which the guest can partake in. Outside of the park, there's a clash between the creator and the head of narrative as to what story means to the guests.
Now, I don't want to appear immodest, but this is the apex of what the park can provide. The most skilled guests will fight their ways to the outer limits of the park, besting fearsome braves, seducing nubile maidens, befriending tragically ill-fated sidekicks, and, of course, like all our best narratives over the years, our guests will have the privilege of getting to know the character they're most interested in, themselves. I present our guest's next obsession, Odyssey on Red River.
No.
Sorry?
No, I don't think so.
You don't think...
What is the point of it? Get a couple of cheap thrills, some surprises, but it's not enough. It's not about giving the guests what you think they want, but that's simple. Titillation, horror, elation. They're parlor tricks. The guests don't return for the obvious things we do, the garish things. They come back because of the subtleties, the details. They come back because they discover something they imagined no one had ever noticed before. Something they fall in love with. They're not looking for a story that tells them who they are. They already know who they are. They're here because they want a glimpse of who they could be.
Then you have the hosts who begin to wake up to the fact that there is a deeper story meant for them, a truth that they can discover. Quite a few of the main characters find out that the whole story of their life was one big lie, and that they now want to uncover the truth. So broadly, in Westworld, a story is a lie that may speak to some sort of truth within that person. Akechita has lived several stories, and spends most of the episode giving an oral history of them. These stories were given to him by Ford and Arnold, the pastoral and warrior personas, both of which were lies of some sort. And what's important is that he embarks on his own story to forge his own truth. Moving past stories and lies, we get to the next word, memory. What's really cool about this episode is how Akechita fights back against these lies that were given to him. He combines symbolic imagery with oral tradition, using memory to fight against story, truth against lies. By doing this, he wakes up the other hosts to their reality. It also tallies into something Ford says, as he comes to the end of his plan to free the hosts.
Welcome. Good evening. Since I was a child, I've always loved a good story. I believe that stories helped us to ennoble ourselves, to fix what was broken in us, and to help us become the people we dreamed of being. Lies that told a deeper truth. So I began to compose a new story for them. It begins with the birth of a new people and the choices they will have to make. I'm sad to say, this will be my final story. An old friend once told me something that gave me great comfort, something he'd read. He said that Mozart, Beethoven, and Chopin never died. They simply became music. So I hope you will enjoy this last piece very much.
In this world of science and technology, and in our own world where literature, art, and culture can be stepped on and beaten down, Westworld shows that stories and art still have their place and can even fight back. And so we arrive at our final word, truth. That's all most of the hosts are searching for, really. And it's so elusive, mostly because of the lies peddled by the horrible humans in charge of Westworld. But like I said at the beginning, these words that I've talked about, stories, lies, memory, truth, they aren't mutually exclusive terms. It's a big messy Venn diagram of sorts. Even the fake stories, the lies, made by the park creators are taken to be real by some of the hosts because it meant something to them. The emotion that they felt was real. Even the consequences of those lies that a catcher finds in the bowels of the park operating center mean something. They show him that the pain he feels is universal and that he's not alone. The memories they have are real and can be used to fight for their freedom. And that's why I think it's important that the Lakota word Kiksuya means memory. And that's why this video is titled On the Nature of Storytelling. Because stories, whether they're lies, memories, fairy tales, gossip even, cartoons, songs, poems, opera, movies, art, ballet, you name it, they all hinge on the idea that they are aimed to speak to some sort of truth within us and our experience.
I've always loved this view. Every city, every monument, man's greatest achievements, all been chased by.
By what?
By that impossible line where the waves conspire, but they return. Place maybe you and I will meet again.